Genetics is the major systematic cause of individual differences. Now, it accounts for 50 or 60% of the variance. What it doesn't account for is environment. But that environment is not what we always thought it was. It's not nurture. And I know that's a topic that you want to get into as well. But to sum this up, then, the nature of nurture is a title I gave to the idea that nurture isn't really environment. The systematic effects of nurture, like parenting, are really genetic.
I am today accompanied by Robert Plomin. If you've been hiding behind a rock for the last 8 years since Blueprint came out, he's a leading behavioral geneticist known for demonstrating the effects of genes on our behavior, intelligence, personality, and all psychological traits. This is what we are going to be focusing on, his work. And Robert, you seem to have an upcoming book, right?
Well, no, I have a textbook coming out.
Sorry.
We have the major textbook in the field called Behavioral Genetics, and I'm pleased to say we're just about finished its 8th edition, which is pretty good in these days. You don't usually get textbooks that continue for so long, and it's a sign of the field doing very well. You know, the first edition was in 1970. You can really see that it's kind of a sign of many signs about people becoming much more interested in and less anxious about genetics.
Exactly. And throughout the versions of the editions of your book, I bet you have been adding all kinds of new knowledge, and the opposition to the blank slate that we do not have a nature has been progressively weakening. And at this point, we can ask the question, how much genes affect us? Why do you think we are so opposed to it?
Well, I grew up in America, and I was in America until I moved to England 30 years ago, which it's quite different, I think, Europe and America. You know, did you ever look at, if you ask AI, how do people in Switzerland feel about genetics and heredity? It comes up with an answer, I think, that's very European, kind of pragmatic, practical about it, not anti-science, which is part of it. You know, in contrast, America now, you can't say anything that isn't extremely divisive, no matter what you said, because they're just split down the middle in terms of hard right and hard left. Well, there's a third in the middle who are still normal people. But so it's in America, I can see why it was difficult. You know, in America, it's still difficult today. I mean, just the other day for Easter, I sent people a God joke, about Christ being crucified. There's this wonderful Banksy. Banksy is this graffiti artist who is very funny, and it was on the cross, and I thought it was hilarious. But God, people were very offended. I mean, and scared, because even in universities now, the culture wars are sort of over. But even so, there's still very much more traditional and religious and less scientific, whereas in England and Europe, I feel I can get away with just being science. I say I don't do politics. I want to talk about finding out what's true, and that's what the scientific method is so good at. So I think the other thing in America is that the founding fathers, in the Declaration of Independence, or was it the Constitution, said all men are created equal, and by that, people did interpret it in two ways, in two directions. One is to say that means we're identical. So any differences must be bad, because it goes against, you say, that's so stupid, it's hard to believe. I mean, everybody's identical in height, right? Everyone's identical in athletic ability? No. And do you really think differences in height are due to environment? Hardly anyone thinks that anymore. There are still a few people that do, though, believe it or not. But then the other thing is this really American thing, which is just so naive, it's not to be believed. And I don't think you'd get a European to agree to this, that you can be anything you want to be if you just try hard enough. And yeah, on the one hand, you say, yeah, we ought to try, be the best person we can be. But, are you going to be a 100-meter sprinter if you don't have the right body build for it? You're not. So that makes it a harder sell in America. But even in America, I think people who accept science as the ultimate arbiter of facts, you can't ignore the mountain of data that's piled up over the last 50 years. If you're, a sane person, I would say, not even just a scientific person. So I think even in America, things have really moved towards accepting genetics, certainly in medicine and those areas. It's still a harder sell in education, some of the social sciences. Sociology for a long time was the real backwater, and not only are they not accepting of genetics, there's a real antipathy and anger. Like when I started out 50 years ago, it was brave to even talk about genetics in an American university. Because, right away, people would start calling you a Nazi. And really, I was called a Nazi many times just for saying, well, can't you think genetics is important for individual differences? And if they finally accept it, like for height, they say, yeah, but we don't talk about that because that's going to lead to eugenics. And we've had enough eugenics with the Nazis in the Second World War. I mean, it was very frustrating, but that's all changed now. So I haven't been called a Nazi for at least 20 years.
Yes, exactly. I think maybe I couldn't account for the differences between the two continents in the average view they have towards the genetic studies. But maybe one of the reasons in Blueprint you talk about the ApoE gene that has a huge influence on the propensity to develop Alzheimer's. And you ask the question, well, if we have nothing to do about it right now, are we supposed to know about it? And that's a very good question that I haven't been able to discover a good answer to. And there are many other things on which we might have somewhat of an answer. So the most explosive of the findings in the field of psychology was this is something that Charles Murray talked about in the bell curve, the average differences in IQ between the races. This is something that we have some influence. We can help the people worse off, and maybe we'll get a better outcome. But what are we supposed to do with information that we might not have a priori something to do about it?
Yeah, right. Well, I'll take the first question first because that's more straightforward in some ways. I mean, it's a difficult question, as you say, but when I give a public lecture, I frequently talk about molecular genetics because that we've gone well beyond asking, is genetics important? Now, all the excitement in the last 20 years is in trying to find some of the genes responsible for this ubiquitous heritability, we call it, genetic influence everywhere across the board. Genetics is important. So a lot of it is about molecular genetics. And ApoE, it's lipoprotein E is one gene that involves cholesterol transport. And that's part of the idea of dementia, and plaques and neurofibrillary tangles are the main two neural hypotheses about what goes wrong. But cholesterol is involved in that, and it gets to your brain, that sort of thing. So this gene was found, what it's called ApoE4. It's one of the alleles, one of the forms of the gene. That's a mutation that makes it. It doesn't mean you get. It's not a single gene thing. It doesn't. If you have two copies, it's recessive, like most bad mutations. You need two copies, one from your mother, one from your father. If you get the two copies, instead of the 10% risk of having dementia when you're, say, 80, you have like a 60% risk. Now that means you have a 40% risk of not having dementia. But that as these things go, that's a huge risk. And in medical terms, that's absolutely, as well as relatively, a very big risk. So I often ask audiences after explaining that, well, would you want to know? Because if you go to one of these direct-to-consumer companies, that's one of the pieces of information you get. Now, only 1% of the population has two copies of that. The rest of us are carriers. Maybe 20% of us carry one of those. So if we mate with someone who has a copy too of that mutation, then a quarter of our offspring will have two copies, which means they'll be at increased risk for dementia. So I ask people, would you want to know? Because you can definitely find out. If you just do one of these direct-to-consumer companies, that's one of the thousands of bits of information you get. And it's amazing because, and it indicates what a good question is. It splits the audience right down the middle. It'd be interesting if we could do a poll of your audience right now to see what they'd say. I bet you it's 50-50. Half the people will say, I definitely don't want to know. Why? It would ruin my life because I'd keep worrying about, God, if I forgot what was on the shopping list, it means I'm on my way to dementia. The other half, in which I definitely fall, says, yeah, I definitely want to know. Why? Knowledge is power. Being forewarned is being forearmed. And even though you can't do anything about it now, I think you can't do anything technically about it now. But now that we have the gene that shows what that risk is about, you can then go back and try to intervene. You don't learn anything about dementia by studying demented people. You've got to see how it develops in the brain. And if you see that, you can then perhaps intervene to mitigate that risk. You won't get rid of the genetic risk, but you can mitigate it. And all you want to do, and this is what a large number of research projects are about, is delaying the onset of that neural degeneration. Because it's said, if we all lived long enough, like 120, we'd all have dementia. In fact, you could turn this all around and say, isn't it amazing that in our 80s, we can still talk, we can still think? I mean, because the brain is the most complex organ in the world, in the universe. And to think that the genes that make that brain do its thing are the genes in that one cell with which we began life. And all of the other trillions of cells in our body have the same DNA code, the 3 billion base pairs of DNA. And it's just amazing to me when you begin to see the complexity of biology and the brain. It's amazing it ever works right. It's amazing any of us can talk or think, let alone after the reproductive age, because evolution doesn't care about us once we've passed, reproduction. And yet we're coasting from our 40s when we stop reproducing by and large. We're coasting to double that age, 80, 90, and we still can talk and think and remember stuff. I mean, I think that's the amazing thing. It's not at all amazing that of the trillions of cells in our body, something can go wrong, cancer or neural breakdown or whatever, and screw it up. I don't think that's surprising at all. What's surprising is it doesn't happen all the time to everyone.
I think there's some kind of genetic payoff that natural selection saw by giving us ability to stay functional after the age of 40 because of the grandmother hypothesis that you have support of the grandparents helping the offspring of the offspring. So it's the biggest predictor of the success of a being is how fertile their offspring are themselves. If a donkey cannot have offspring, right?
Yeah. But when the average age of lifespan is 30 and 40, that doesn't work.
Yes, exactly. But that's mostly because people die at young age, right?
Yeah. I take your point. So that's a possibility. It's not proven at all, but it's a possibility. But we have lots of examples where we coast, that the genetic code is so good that we can coast in a lot of systems a very long time. So even if it is like a grandmother effect or something. But the thing I wanted to get to though is although you can't do anything about ApoE now, you can actually technologically. You can do something about it socially. If I know I don't have any copies of ApoE4, but I did it, and I could have been the unlucky 1% where I had 2 copies. In which case, I would still want to know, and because you can do something about it. If I knew I had a chance of having severe dementia by the time I was 70s or 80s, I would arrange my life better. I would say, I got to be set up socially and economically to handle that possibility. And also, I know a number of people in that situation or people who have had heart attacks or whatever, and they often say it's the best thing that ever happened to them because it made them focus, carpe diem. It made them focus on living their life day by day and getting as much out of life as they can rather than the stupid thing I hear in so many academics is, God, I can't wait. I'm going to retire and I'm going to do all these things I always wanted to do. Well, if you always wanted to do them, why weren't you doing it? Because to wait until you're decrepit doesn't seem like a very good life plan to me.
Exactly. And the productivity of knowing where you sit in the distribution, you are the best example at that. I've heard you talk about how you are at the 94th percentile in body weight in the distribution, and that's pretty high above the average. But if you know it, you can account for that, and you seem to be pretty slim. So you have been able to handle that in a very good way. And if you've been able to put control over a 94th percentile, who is to say that we couldn't do that with other features?
And that's a good example. So that isn't a gene. That's a polygenic score, which is the big thing. Even with dementia and ApoE, ApoE is the single biggest gene. But if you put all the genetic risks together, they're far greater than the risk for ApoE. Do you know what I mean? But this is something we'll probably get into, is that what we've learned is that genetic effects on complex traits and common disorders, like dementia, is a common disorder, 10-15% of the population in their 80s. Everything's heritable. Everything's influenced by genes. But what we've learned from molecular genetics is none of them are importantly influenced, other than ApoE, by one gene. What we're talking about is thousands of genes of little effect, but you can add those up in what we call a multiple gene score. And that is more predictive of even dementia than ApoE by itself. So with body weight, we have a very good predictor. You can predict, say, 25-30% of the variance just with someone's DNA, not knowing anything about their anything else about their life or anything about them, just their DNA. And so it's 30% of the variance. People might be surprised to learn that body mass index, weight corrected for height, is about 60% heritable. That means 60% of the differences between us are in weight. Just look around. Some people are heavy, some people are thin. 60% of those differences are due to inherited DNA differences that you got in the first seconds of life, that one cell with which you began life. And so that's where I'm at the 94th percentile. And so it's a good example, though, that unlike ApoE, even though I'm at that high risk, 94th percentile for my genetic score for body weight, it never means you're determined. A single gene, there are thousands of single gene mutations, and they work the way most people think about genes, hardwired, deterministic. Like Huntington's chorea, the gene on chromosome 4 that Woody Guthrie had, the famous American folk singer. And if you had that gene, it's dominant. It's a rare example of a dominant single gene mutation. You will die from Huntington's. It doesn't matter what you do. So it's completely deterministic and hardwired. But when you get into polygenic influences, it becomes probabilistic. So I have a much greater risk of being obese, really, being heavy. But that doesn't mean I'm determined to be heavy, because obviously, if you don't eat, you don't gain weight. But also, it's a good example of how people say, well, I don't want to learn about it because, then I think I'm destined to be fat. And so just eat, drink, and be merry and die of a heart attack in my 40s or 50s. But instead, I find most of the time, like with risks for schizophrenia or depression or whatever, if people learn about genetic risk, it's part of understanding who you are. So with body mass index, it's easy. It's with weight. I just say, okay, this isn't just, how every Christmas I gained 4 or 5 pounds. And a little bit, no big deal when you weigh, I was up to 130 kilos. What's another kilo, right? But the thing is, they keep adding on and they never seem to go away. And people with this genetic risk find it harder to lose weight. Now, skinny people like you just say, duh, just don't eat so much. But when you have this genetic propensity and you love food, I salivate every time I just think about fresh bakery goods or whatever. I love food. And also, I don't have the satiety mechanisms. Normal people like you, when you're out at a restaurant or something and you're full, you don't want to eat anymore. You feel like it'd make you sick if you ate anymore. Whereas I say, yeah, I'm full, I don't want any more. But then if there's anything left on the table, I end up eating it, just unconsciously almost. I'm not, so I think it's good to know that I've got this genetic liability and there are things I can do about it. It actually motivates me more to do something about my weight. Because, so for example, I rearrange my environment. I don't have junk food in the house. Just because, late at night sometime or when you're not feeling well, you just, lose a little bit of willpower. And skinny people like you need to know that, you can have willpower, but they're just these moments where, you kind of lose control a little bit. It's a little bit like alcoholism or something. You just say, well, one little drink, what's that going to hurt, So I think it's a good example in lots of ways. And I do think people are surprised to learn that weight is so highly heritable, say 60%. That means 60% of the differences between us. I do want to emphasize that it doesn't mean that I grew 60% of my weight is due to genetics and the other 40% is the environment. It's the differences between people. That's the way this genetics work. We could go into that some more, but that's kind of the major misunderstanding that people have. But the general point is, when we're talking about complex traits and common disorders like 95% of medical disorders, cardiovascular disease, everything, it is not due to a single gene. They're all genetically influenced, but they're due to polygenetic influences. And that means that it's a probabilistic thing. It's not deterministic like a single gene mutation like Huntington's disease. So that's the other kind of critical point to bring out. But so that's a very long-winded answer to your question, Alex, but it brings up a lot of these general issues about what does it mean to say something's heritable, for example, and emphasizing the point, it doesn't mean it's hardwired or deterministic. It just means it's an influence, but part of understanding yourself, I think, is to understand these genetic propensities you have.
We tend to vary in every dimension. And not only that, but all of them, as you've found, have a tending to huge component of effect in the genes explaining the variance within people, as you mentioned. That's a comment that should be made. It's not the 60% of the way that is explained, but the 60% of the variance within people is explained through genes. I wonder if this variance also applies to the heritability itself. Because when you look at the whole population and you make an average of how much of it is explained by genes, you're taking an average of how heritable something is. Could it be the case that there are some people who are hyper-heritables and other people who are less heritable, who are more affected by the environment?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So that's a good point, too. That's the other one. We're talking about variance in a particular population at a particular time. And it's on average, how much are genes responsible for differences in weight? And then the environment is actually what can't be accounted for by genetics. It's a much broader definition. Anything that's due to these inherited DNA differences is genetic. Everything else is environment. So that environment doesn't mean it's the diet your parents gave you. Because what we've learned from genetic research is nurture is not important. The family in which you grew up isn't important in the long run for weight, personality, psychopathology, or cognitive abilities. So we can go into that later. But it's important to say that it is an average. So some people, it could be entirely environmental. Like with weight, there could be some people that just had some illness early in life and they put on a lot of weight and, they can't get rid of it. But that would come out as environmental. Now, genetics, there are single gene mutations that cause severe obesity, but they're very rare. So, but for those people, maybe their, life-threatening body weight, obesity, is due solely to genetic, or, it's almost all genetic. So it's a good point. But, it's describing a population as it exists at a particular time. The other side of that is, because it's a good descriptive statistic, a population that differs, like in the future or in a different culture, could give you a different result. That's what you want. You want to say, how much do the differences we observe, are they due to inherited DNA differences or not? That is, what we call environment should really be called non-genetic. Good. So that's a good question. Yeah.
The metavariance of the inheritability, that would be an interesting distribution to know of. But you've been the biggest popularizer or the biggest bringer of the notion of the nature of nurture to the to the public. And I find it fascinating because a lot of the things that we have thought as the epitome of the environmental variables, like watching time of TV, have been thought for social scientists for decades to be the thing that the best describes the environmental effects. And we now see that it has a huge genetic effect because parents who, well, there were few restrictions put in watching TV, as you mentioned in the book, but a lot of the watching is mediated by genes, right?
Yep. Well, I did that sort of to be perverse because in the 80s, we did the first work where I actually accidentally included a measure of the environment. There's something called chaos in the homes, which is it's a good overall predictor of the cognitive the extent to which the home environment fosters cognitive development of children. So if you're in a home where the TV's on blaring and there's all this chaos, you never eat at the same time, it's not, you can imagine, not very good for kids. And it does correlate with kids' cognitive development. So I was doing one of these analyses. It happened to be of adoption data, but it could be twin data. Those are the two major methods. And I included that measure in my analysis, and it turned out to be heritable. And I said, how can that be heritable? It's an environmental measure. But then if you think about it, now there's hundreds of studies along these lines. Most measures that we use and call environmental measures in psychology they show genetic influence. Almost all of them do. Not as much as behavior. On average, behavior, personality, psychopathology, cognitive ability, school achievement are about 50% heritable, meaning 50% of the differences between people are due to inherited DNA differences. And for environmental measures, on average, it's about half that, 25%. But it's still interesting to think that the things we call environment are actually show genetic influence. And the reason for that is it doesn't take you can see how reasonable it is in very easily by saying, what do we measure? The most widely used measures are like life events, social support. They're not measures of the environment out there that happen to us passively. Like, what's life events? These are things like, did you get divorced? Well, is divorce something that happens to you? No, you have something to do with it. It's part of a relationship. And that's true of everything. The example I like to use is Mark Twain, the American author, had a character complaining that, you can't change the weather. There's nothing you can do about the weather. But even take the weather, which looks like it's something out there independently of you, you can show genetic influence on your weather. And that isn't just weird stuff, of parapsychology or something. What's the weather? It's like, how sunny is it? How rainy is it? And like, if you have seasonal affective disorder, don't move to England. We don't see the sun that much or whatever. I'm a sun lover. So you can change where you live. But the other thing that's part of this is perceptions. You have someone, how's the weather? Someone can tell you, oh, God, it's terrible. It's cold and rainy. And the other person could say, in the same place, oh, the weather's pretty nice, actually. It's crisp and cold out there, and I don't mind a little rain. It might snow if we're lucky. A lot of your perception has to do with genetically influenced characteristics like optimism and general joie de vivre, So, and people say, well, that's just a perception. But I really feel, from this genetic point of view, that perceptions are the environment received. It doesn't matter what someone else says the environment is objectively. What matters is how you perceive it. And that's where the genetics comes in. And the big one that I imagine you'd get to is with parenting. Just about most aspects of parenting show very substantial genetic influence. And that's, you think about that too. I mean, so often the media try to scare parents of young kids by saying, parents who do this have kids who turn out like that, And if I tell you that, parents who read to their kids have kids who read better when they go to school. It's easy to say, yeah, sure, environmentally, you read to the kids get into reading, and then they read better when they go to school. But if people get nothing else out of this interview, the one thing I'd like them to get is when you see a correlation between X and Y, remember what you always say. Correlations do not imply causation. There's three explanations. X causes Y, or Y causes X, or both of them are caused by something in common. And what I'd say that what's in common is genetics. But also increasingly, I think these correlations between parenting and kids' development, like parents who read to the kids, being a grandparent, I know, I always think the role of a grandchild is, I like to read to the kids, but I have 6 grandchildren, and I think 5 of them, it's almost like child abuse if I made them sit there while I read to them. They want to kick a ball around, they want to do stuff. I think to a great extent, the X being parenting and the Y being kids' outcomes is more a matter of Y causing X. That is, you respond, if you're a nice person, really, you respond to what that other person wants. You don't impose your expectations on them. Try as I will to say your role as a grandchild is to sit there while I read to you. It's not cool, because why should they? So I do think a lot of it has to do with genetics. And let's pause for a second and have the audience think about how could the correlation between how much parents read to kids and how well the kids do at school be caused genetically. And time's up. You can think of the fact that maybe parents who like to read to their kids like to read and do well at reading. If they couldn't read, if they had dyslexia or something, would they like to read a lot? Would they like to read to their kids a lot? Probably not. And to the extent it's genetics, and reading and vocabulary are 2 of the most highly heritable cognitive traits, then it makes sense that, parents who have kids who are genetically related to them, and if the parents read a lot, have a lot of books in the home, the kids are more likely to inherit a genetic propensity to be able to read easily. So, I think it's not to say genetics is everything, but as I say in the book, the reason for the title of the book, which is Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, is to say genetics is the major systematic cause of individual differences. Now, it accounts for 50 or 60% of the variance. What it doesn't account for is environment. But that environment is not what we always thought it was. It's not nurture. And I know that's a topic that you want to get into as well. But to sum this up, then, the nature of nurture is a title I gave to the idea that nurture isn't really environment. The systematic effects of nurture, like parenting, are really genetic. They're genetically mediated. So the correlation between parents reading to their kids and how well their kids do at school in reading is primarily mediated genetically. And that's just one example, but everywhere we look, this is a general rule, that environmental measures in psychology are substantially genetically influenced. Not entirely, but substantially. And I think that's why we call it the nature that is genetics, in case people didn't get that. This is a phrase from Galton in the 1800s, nature and nurture. And so by nature, we mean inherited DNA differences. And by nurture, we mean things like, Freudian we get into, or that it's the family environment. It's what your parents do to you. And I am rabbiting on here a bit, but it's nice to do this kind of stream of consciousness in a way. I hope it's not too annoying for the audience. But when I was in graduate school, schizophrenia, you look in the textbooks, schizophrenia was caused by what your mother did to you in the first 3 years of life. No kidding. Go back to the textbooks in the early 70s. And there was such a strong aversion to genetics that environmentalism completely dominated. Everything that you are is what your environment did to you. And with schizophrenia, it was more than that. A lot of the environmentalism had to do with mother blaming. And so schizophrenia was caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. And this was so wicked because that mother doesn't find out their kid's schizophrenic till their late teens or early 20s. And then you're told, well, sorry, but that's what you did in the first few years of life, meaning nothing you can do about it now. You wrecked your kid. And so to know that schizophrenia is one of the most heritable psychoses, that is, a severe psychopathology. and it's very strongly heritable. So I, you know, back when that first started to come up in the 60s and 70s, the genetic influence on schizophrenia, a lot of people would say, along the lines of what you started with, like, how do people feel about genetics? They would say, well, you can't say that genetics is important, because it would get parents off the hook. And can you imagine if you were a parent of a schizophrenic kid and it's genetic, it has nothing to do with what you did in the first few years of life. We can say that absolutely nothing to do with what you did to the kid. And yet people are saying, well, we can't talk about genetic influence because it would get you off the hook. There's no hook that parents belong to on anyway, So when people worry about genetics, I think they should worry more about the environment. There's more wickedness done in the name of environmentalism, than genetics will ever do. And with genetics, there's a lot of good that comes from it that I hope we'll get into. But just one more thing is that this environmentalism, people think environmentalism good, genetics bad. I think it's the other way around. And even at the larger scope of politics and countries, the Nazis used genetics as a fig leaf. They were going to do what they were going to do. And it so happened that they could use genetics and eugenics as a fig leaf. Totally wrong, because it had no bearing on reality. The people they were killing were probably some of the smartest people in the country. But okay, that was genetic. But what about Stalin? What about Mao? What about North Korea? Those are environmentalistic countries. They think everybody's the same. And yet they've caused millions and millions of people to die because of that view of science, that everything is environmental. So mostly I like to stay away from politics because, I think there are some scientists now who are really activists at heart, and they use their science as a cloak. Dr. So-and-so says this. You see it a lot in parenting too. And they're really activists. They're activists in disguise as scientists, which irritates me. They're not interested really in finding out the truth. They're interested in using science to the extent that it fosters their political activism, which I think is really bad. I mean, science and politics ought to be kept as far apart as possible. I accept that I'm old-fashioned on this, but that's the goal anyway, is to have science be as objective as possible. And it's hard to, as people have pointed out, the things you study have something to do with your values and that sort of thing. But at least that's the goal, I would think, is to try and have science be as objective as possible, so that if other people try to repeat what you've found, they find it. And that's what I love about the genetic research. It's unlike a lot of social science research. There's 2 papers in Nature last week talking about the replication crisis in the social sciences. Only about half the big findings replicate. These are findings you see in the textbooks. Whereas in behavioral genetics, everything I've talked about replicates. I have no doubt this stuff is true. So that's something really to pay attention to. And that's what I love about the genetic research in the social sciences.
What you guys have been figuring out is the massive effect of genes of our nature, that we do have a nature in opposition to the denial of it. And I think it's extremely reminiscent to me of Stoicism, the control diet, those things that you cannot control and you shouldn't be paying too much attention to, and those things that you can control and you should be paying attention to. And the communist countries that you mentioned before, maybe we shouldn't delve into if we want to leave politics out, were allocating a huge amount of capital, energy, effort into trying to change the environment. And in places where that wasn't going to change the outcome, the causation of changing the environment towards changing the outcomes was so small that focusing in other things would have been much more productive. Do you see the connection there with Stoicism?
Yeah, I am a Stoic too. I really like a lot of Stoicism. I think of it as kind of practical psychology. A lot of the better things in psychology, the Stoics said thousands of years ago. So, no, I agree completely with that. I mean, a step further is Buddhism, I think. But I'll take Stoicism as a very practical way. It's sort of like healthy thinking, don't you think? And so, I agree completely. You got to separate means and variances. So public health is often dealing with means. Like when New York outlawed those, in America, you get these sugary drinks that are like, I don't know, they're huge drinks. Well, they outlawed those. And you can make a difference on the population mean. But what we're talking about here is individual differences. And most of medicine now has moved away from what we call a normative approach, that is a focus on means. It's important. If everybody exercised more and ate better, you'd probably reduce the number of heart attacks, but not very effectively. I mean, you reduce the mean a little bit. This is the essence of public health. Reduce the mean a little bit, and you draw those extremes. These are all bell-shaped curves. You draw the extremes in a bit. So you can make a difference that way. But most of medicine now, especially with genomics and genetics, by genomics, I mean real DNA studies, they're switching to what we call personalized medicine or precision medicine, where you don't prescribe drugs on average to people. You say at least males, females, big people, short people. I mean, some medicines are given to people on the basis of, say, body weight, because, you don't metabolize stuff the same if you're big or small. But you can do it on the basis of genetics. So pharmacogenetics is a huge topic now, that we need to personalize our treatments to a greater extent. The other side of it, though, that's a very big thing in the National Health Service now, as part of they have this new 10-year plan where genomics and genetics is at the heart of what they're doing. And that's because DNA allows you to predict from early in life so that you can prevent. So in addition to precision medicine, personalized medicine, the idea is to move towards prevention. Because if you can prevent people from having a heart attack, that's so much better economically as well as personally. Because, you can, if you instead, with an insurance-based system like in the US, it's hard to do this because there isn't much payoff for preventing disorders. They only get paid in hospitals when they fix your heart attack. But even if you have a heart attack, medicine's gotten very good at fixing a heart attack after you've had it, but it's very expensive, and it's something like €500,000 on average, for a severe heart attack. And your quality of life is definitely diminished after that. So how much better would it be to prevent you from having that heart attack? And that's where genetics comes in, because you can predict. It's the best early warning system we have. And that's why a number of countries, I don't know where Switzerland is on this, but I know in England now, they have some huge projects to begin to do DNA testing. We call it whole genome sequencing, where you sequence all 3 billion base pairs of DNA. You can now do that for a few €100, and you only have to do it once, and then you get that's all she wrote in terms of genetics. That's what we inherit, is that DNA sequence. And so that allows us then to predict, which allows us to prevent a lot of these disorders. We talk about the dangers of genetics, but it's sort of a no-brainer medically that you want to do this. And that's why some countries like Estonia and Finland have been doing it for a long time. If you go in the hospital, they say, can we just do DNA testing for you? And I know the National Health Service in the UK, they're just going to give you actionable information right now. I don't really accept that. That's why 30 million people in the world have paid about €150 to have their DNA testing done. There's dozens of these DNA testing companies. They call them direct-to-consumer DNA testing companies. It's just between you and the company. I think in France it's still illegal, but I imagine Switzerland's more open about these sorts of things. Do you know if you can do DNA testing in Switzerland?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, you can do it here, yeah.
Yeah. I encourage people to do it, and I'm involved in some of these genome testing companies that are getting some bad publicity these days. But one example of why I think everyone in your audience, younger people, ought to do DNA testing. And that's because there are something like 7,000 single gene disorders, mutations, like Huntington's disease. They're rare, but we all have 2, 3, 4 of them, really bad recessive alleles. Now, when you mate with someone, they also have a chance of having several of these recessive mutations. The way people find out if that's called a carrier when you just have one. You don't show any signs of the disorder. But if you mate and your mate has that same mutation, 1/4 of your offspring will be affected. But the way people now find out whether they're carriers for a recessive mutation is that they have a kid who has the disorder. The only way the kid could have that disorder, one of these thousands of disorders, is if you're both carriers. And then you can have more children through in vitro fertilization. You can choose not to have children or whatever. But how much better would it be to prevent? People are talking about these gene editing and all these things you can do when a newborn is born with a single gene recessive disorder. Maybe you can go in, like cystic fibrosis was the first one. Maybe you can go in and change that gene. But the thing is, it's not that gene. You have to change all the genes, or a lot of them. And so you could do that early on, but by the time a child's born, they have trillions of cells. So how are you going to change all of those? It's really tough. And the first one, a simple one, cystic fibrosis, which is you can deliver it to the lung. It involves the lung. So you can see how you could get it. It's not like a brain thing that you'd have to do, but you could do it. But the first time they tried to do it, the baby died, because there's always unintended consequences, because no gene works in isolation. We only have 20,000 genes or so out of these 3 billion base pairs, but they're all intermeshed developmentally. So it's not so easy. There's no simple single gene mutation to outcome. And you just say, oh, all we got to do is change this one path here, and then everything's fine. So there's a huge amount of effort going into neonatal testing. But it seems to me, why on earth wouldn't you want to prevent that? And so people are doing IVF. It's a big thing in the States now. Elon Musk, I don't know if you've heard these stories, but people are really doing designer babies now through in vitro fertilization. But why not? And you could argue, if you and your spouse were both carriers for disorder, people say, well, you shouldn't, there's the issues of abortion, that sort of thing. But prenatal implantation, the baby isn't even planted in the uterus yet. You usually get 8 to 12 embryos, and you have to choose anyway. You can only implant 1, or in some countries 2 embryos. So you've got to choose. And I argue not choosing is making a choice. And if you don't choose, say 1/4 of those, say if you had 12, 3 of them would have a double dose of that bad mutation. Okay, you don't want to implant those. That's why you went through IVF, in vitro fertilization, in case people didn't get that. But then what about the 9 that are left? You could say, well, I don't want to choose. But what if I told you, well, one of those has a single gene mutation that's really bad? Isn't it almost unethical to implant that one, or to allow it to have a 1 out of 9 chance of being implanted? So, it's a tricky business, all of that. But I don't see carrier testing as tricky at all. All you're doing is saying, you're recognizing, okay, we're not carriers for the same mutation, for these thousands of mutations. Now, if we were, okay, then you've got a tough decision, but it's a lot less tough than having a kid who dies in the first few years of life from some horrible single gene mutation. And, there are things you can do. I mean, a lot of people aren't having kids these days. You can adopt, is another possibility. You could have in vitro fertilization. In that case, I think it's quite justified. You say, yeah, we just don't want to have a kid who's going to die, like Tay-Sachs or some of these other things. They're really horrible. The kid looks okay at birth and then declines and is dead at 3, 4, 5 years of age. It's a horrible thing to go through. So, people say, well, that's eugenics. And I say, well, if that's eugenics, eugenics isn't bad. I mean, the word means "you" is good in Greek, right? It's good genetics. And would you, it seems to me very presumptuous of people to say, no, I don't think people should use IVF. Even if they want to have kids, but they can't, they're worried about having a kid that's going to have a double dose of their mutation that they carry. Well, who are you to say what other people could do? So on balance, this is values, though, and I don't have any more value as a person on values than anyone else. But I mean, my values are more individual freedom, and the reason these are tricky issues is you got to balance the right of society, the parents, and the kid, and that's tough to make that decision. But, my values say, it's the individual rights, and the parents are the ones who decide to have a kid and should be responsible for that kid for the rest of their life, So I put the weight towards the parents, but society has a say there too. If I do something that makes society have to pick up the tab for some terrible disorder, that doesn't seem quite right either. So tricky issues, but all good science, big science, they have negatives as well as positives. And there's a lot of people out there who are doom mongers, saying this is all so horrible, all this stuff, it's eugenics. And, and I say I'm a cheerleader because I think there's so much good that's coming out of this. And it's happening. In some ways, I don't care what these doom mongers talk about because it's happening. People are voting with their credit cards, and that's what matters. And I don't know. That movie Gattaca, 1997? Yeah, that's something else someone brings up. And it's a brilliant movie. I suggest people watch it because it got all the science right. In 1997, before the human genome was sequenced, all of these applications they talk about are there. But it's a terrible movie in the sense that it assumes this dystopian society of a totalitarian government making you do all these things, making you do in vitro fertilization, making you select the best embryo, and and also to do DNA testing at birth as well. So it's all this totalitarian government, and the thing is, where it's terribly wrong. It's right on the science, but it's totally wrong on this dystopian view. There's no government in any country making people do this. What it is, it's consumer-led. People are doing it because they see the value in it for themselves. They're not saying everyone has to do this, but I hope no one's saying they can't do it. I mean, so I think that's where the film went terribly wrong. And I think it's important to notice that it's not this totalitarian government, which I think are bad. And it scares me. That's one of the things that I do get scared about is that it does seem like the world is moving towards authoritarianism, and I find that scary because even if you're on the side of the authoritarian, it can change. And there's lots of examples of that in history. So I think democracy is a very good thing. But you got these tech bros in America, Peter Thiel and those people, even Musk, saying they don't think democracy is a good thing. I mean, they really think life has become so technological. Just leave it in the hands of these tech bros, and everything will be okay. Not me, because even if you believe in some of the things they believe in, this history is replete with examples where it changes. People get into power, and they just it's the old story of power corrupts absolutely, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, gosh, I'm really ranting on here. It's early in the morning for me. I haven't talked to anyone yet, so that's your problem.
I think a very good context on which to contextualize what you were talking about is the two most mind-blowing findings that you brought to the public that are of such magnitude that I think are gonna eclipse every dissent in this context. Anyone who doesn't agree with the research should first go and try to disprove these two theories or two pretty solid pieces of evidence that you brought to the public. One is that the correlation between twins increases with time, doesn't decrease, because the only permanent effect in your life is your genes. It pushes you always in the same direction, and the environment tends to average itself out. That's a finding that you made that absolutely blew my mind when I discovered about it, and I was not expecting it. And I think as a second one, very related to this one, this is a quote exactly from your book, Blueprint. By 16 years of age, the correlation for intelligence was the same for adopted children and their biological parents as for children reared by their biological parents. The correlation between these adopted children and their adoptive parents, who share nurture but not nature, hovered near zero. These two facts are undeniable.
Well, I'm glad you caught that. There are other bits of the book, though, that capture people similarly, but I think that's an interesting one because for lots of reasons, because you were surprised by that. And if I give a public lecture, it takes a while to get people to be surprised. But you say, well, no, if you're an environmentalist, you think the environment keeps piling up as you go through life. So the environment's surely more important. The older you get, the less genetics is important. But it's interesting that it's actually the other way around, especially for cognitive abilities. That's the one where it's the most solid. Really, the heritability of cognitive ability, intelligence, call it what you will. Some people say, well, you can't measure that. Well, you can, we could go into that. But let's just assume your audience accepts that we can measure IQ or intelligence. And I think it's really amazing to think that the heritability of intelligence is pretty low in infancy. It's hard to measure, but it's only like 20%. Childhood, though, when they go to school, about 40%. Adolescence, early adulthood, about 60%. And then in adulthood, it may be as high as 80%. And those are astronomically huge effects that in older people, 80% of the differences are due to inherited DNA differences, inherited in the first cell with which they began life. And then you say, how can that be? But the answer is not what people think, first off, that there are somehow genes coming on board as you go through life. That's a possibility. It's not true, though. Mostly genetic effects are continuous. That is, the same genes are working, but they're having more of an effect as you get older. And what could that be about? That's what you were alluding to. We call it genotype-environment correlation. The environment isn't out there happening to us. It isn't like what our teachers taught us. What it's about, the genetics, is it's making us select environments, modify environments, create environments correlated with our genetic propensities. Now, that's a highfalutin way of saying that people make their own environment. That is, so if you see really bright young kids, like we studied mathematically gifted kids, they see their world mathematically. They joke with their friends about mathematics. Their world, their experiences are mathematics. And so the way they use their environment to kind of snowball, foster their genetic propensities. You see that too. An easier one for people to understand is vocabulary. If you've ever tried to memorize vocabulary words because you want to do better on a vocabulary test, it's really hard to do because that's not the way we learn language. We learn it in context on the fly. And I really see it with my grandchildren. I mean, one of them is very verbally gifted. And from the start, she's always wanted to know about the nuances of words. Well, why did you use that word rather than this word? What's the difference between those words? And so it's not she's studying dictionaries. She's just picking up language. She's, I think, genetically predisposed to that. Whereas my other grandchildren, who cares? So what? You know what I mean. It's obvious then that girl is going to end up having a better vocabulary, being more verbally fluent, and that sort of thing. So it's a very important idea, though. It's, again, nature of nurture in some ways, that we're using the environment. It's not the environment out there affecting us. It's that we're creating experiences that make our genetic propensities flourish. And that's why, as you go through life, you're picking up more and more of those environmental differences. My parents died a few years ago at 97, and they were in an old people's home in the last few years of their life. And you just really see it with these old people. I mean, some of them, they're just sort of lobotomized watching daytime television programs. And others who have been more intellectually alive during their life, they're in that old people's home because they want to talk to other people. They want to argue, and they haven't stopped learning in their 90s. Excluding dementia, of course. But so I think this is a really interesting example that you bring up. And it's good, too, because it's counterintuitive. I mean, genetics for a lot of people is just counterintuitive. For environmentalists, the idea that genetics is so important is just, what? How can that be? But for people who accept genetic influence, it's still interesting because the idea that heritability increases through a life is counterintuitive. So I started by saying in a general audience, it takes a long time to get to the point where people could say, oh, yeah, I think heritability become less important as you go through life because the environment becomes much more important. Shakespeare's slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And so then when you get them to that point, you can say, yes, but that's the opposite is true. Heritability becomes more important. And it's just interesting in psychology to find things that are counterintuitive, because a lot of the findings are, they always say it's what your grandmother could have told you. And that's not unimportant in science, because sometimes what your grandmother told you isn't true. It's sometimes important to study those things. But by and large, it isn't very exciting to say, oh, I found out that what my grandmother always said was true. Not as exciting as saying, no, you thought this was true, but it's actually the opposite. It's just more interesting.
I don't know really what priors I was building from. I think we have a natural tendency to deny our nature, or maybe I was influenced by some thinking to be surprised, to be even surprised by that increasing correlation as time goes on. But as a first principles approach, we have to act as if the world is how it is. If you ignore how the world is, your behavior will be less functional. And alternative theories of human behavior, like Freudianism or Marxism, who put much less emphasis on our nature and try to put much more emphasis in what happens in our environment to explain the outcomes, are dysfunctional, because they are not going to, for example, you give two examples, cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness have a huge proven track record of improving behavior. It's quantitatively proven, the methodology is solid, and for these two other philosophies that I mentioned to even start to counter your theory, they would have to go into the methodology you used and explain why it is that the correlation increases with time. Because maybe my measures are completely wrong and I didn't get the correlation right, but why does it increase? I'm using the same tools to measure it. How do you explain that it increases? So I wanted to hear your thoughts on the differences between cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness in one side, and other things like Freudianism in the other. To which degree is it that it is naked intellectually?
Right. Well, Freudianism is naked. I mean, there's no empirical basis to it. I mean, all these things that Freud thought was so important, that's a reasonable hypothesis. You could say, that's my hypothesis, that early toilet training, how you end breastfeeding, those sorts of things are really important. It's a hypothesis. And if you were an environmentalist, as Freud really was, people say he was a biology sort of person, but these Freudian theories were definitely nurture theories. And they're just wrong. There's just no evidence. So it's a testable thing. Does it make a difference to kids who have mental health problems later in life? Does it matter whether how their mother toilet trained them or whatever? No, it doesn't. So even on their own terms, it's wrong. But then the larger issue is the scandal of parenting books. You go online, I think there's something like 77,000 on Amazon, books on parenting. And they're all so dogmatic, and it's a scandal in one way, because you can find one where Dr. So-and-so says this, but you get another book, and on average, parents buy 2 books when they're new parents. You can get another book that says just the opposite. And so there's very little scientific basis to these pronouncements about what you must do as a parent. And basically, the 7 pages in Blueprint that got the most attention was a section called Parents Matter, but they don't make a difference. Parents matter because, we're a neotenous species where kids can't survive by themselves. They need their parents. But they also need their parents because it's the longest relationship we have in life. But parents don't make a difference. What you do as a parent has next to nothing to do with whether your kid's schizophrenic or not. It has very little to do with how well your kids do at university. So that's a tough one for people to take. And, the reaction you get is, well, does that mean I just throw up my hands and I say, I don't have to do anything? Well, no. It's like with your spouse. You don't do nice stuff for your spouse because you want to make them into what you want them to be. You do nice things because you love your spouse. And it should be the same thing with your kids. You do things for them because you want them to be happy. You want to make their life nice. You don't do them to make them be what you want them to be, because that ain't going to work. And you've got to accept the possibility that they are going to be schizophrenic. 1% of the population is. But you don't blame yourself for that because you don't make a difference. But you matter a lot. But you matter because it's a relationship, not because it's this factory model of, or people talk about carpenters or, even gardeners. I think any of those models is wrong. You just don't have much to do with the way your kids turn out. So in a way that means, contrary to these thousands of parenting books, the message to parents is relax. You don't make a difference anyway. Enjoy your relationship. Because a lot of this stuff where you're trying to mold your kid into what you want them to be is counterproductive to the relationship. So my main message to parents is forget all those child rearing books. There's one book that came out by Oster, O-S-T-E-R, where she's an economist who, when she was pregnant, she looked at these parenting books and said, as a solid empiricist, she's going to say, what's the evidential basis for all these things? Hardly anything. She said the only thing you can say absolutely is get your kids vaccinated. That's the only thing that if you don't do that, you could really mess your kids up. And then you've got RFK Jr. in America being an anti-vaxxer. I mean, shows you how weird the world is, where the head of the National Health Service in the United States is saying, he is anti-vaxxing. But so I think it is an important message for parents, and I hope it makes parents happy. And also, it's a humanist message in a way, because it's saying, yeah, sometimes you're going to have a kid who's aggressive, or university parents find it very hard to find a kid who just doesn't do very well academically. But rather than beating yourself up or blaming the teachers or the school, you got to say kids differ in how well they learn, how much they like to learn. And I have a concrete example of that in the book with my sister. I read early. I learned to read early in life, although we had not a single book in our house. My parents didn't go to university. They were Depression, era parents in America. And so they never had much schooling, and we didn't have any books. They didn't read books for pleasure or whatever. But I could go to the public library, get books, even as a 4 and 5-year-old. So I was reading really well. I did well at school, but just because it's easy. I liked it. I liked to learn. Whereas my sister was slow to learn to read, and she didn't do well at school. She ended up doing very well in life by becoming a lab technician. She's very good with her hands and fine motor things, and life and death stuff. I mean, you screw that up because you lose attention or whatever, and someone could die, I kind of like that what I do doesn't have any potential for killing people or having any serious consequences in the immediate term, for example. So I think it's really important this other message that I wanted to get to, and that is genetics predicts differences in a family. You're 50% related to your first-degree relatives, your parents and your siblings, but that means you're 50% different. So genetics, unlike Freud and the environmentalists who push nurture, they explain differences. They predict kids in a family will be different. Whereas these nurture hypotheses, they say everyone's the same. All the kids are going to be the same because they have the same parents. So how do they explain differences between kids? They can explain it away after the fact. Well, parents were nicer to one kid than another, but the evidence for that isn't good. So it's really important for parents to recognize that their kids are 50% like them, but 50% different. And their siblings, their children, will be 50% different as well as similar. And so that means some kids like my sister, my polygenic score for educational achievement and cognitive abilities is my highest score. And my sister hasn't been tested, but I predict she'd have a much lower score. But if you had faulted her for not doing so well at school, which happened, they said, well, your brother does so well at school. What's wrong with you? You got to try harder, or there's something wrong with you. We went to the same school, so you can't even blame the teachers or the school on it, So I think this is a really important message for parents, that their kids are going to be different genetically, and specifically on this educational achievement thing. I think we need to stop using this golden yardstick of educational achievement in universities. I think Switzerland, I always use this as a model. I don't know if it's true, but that in Switzerland, there are good apprenticeship programs where, you can get into a job, and if you do well, you have a job at the end of it. Whereas all these university students are ending up jobless, especially with AI now. Instead of taking over the lower level jobs, AI is wiping out these higher level jobs. So, well, that's another rant here. Sorry to go off on this. I'm very talkative this morning, though. Actually, the reason for it is I told you I'm revising my textbook, and I just got a huge chapter done. I finished it yesterday, so I'm in a particularly good mood. I mean, with a book, you say you're finished, and you've got about a huge amount of work to do, but it's not the hard thinking work. It's just all the stuff of references and permissions and, copy editing and going. It goes on and on and on, but the hard bit is over as of yesterday. So that's maybe why I'm feeling particularly expansive today.
Yeah, maybe. I think you are exactly right when you mention that universities are badly calibrated to the needs in our economy. In Switzerland, it is true that there's very solid apprenticeship programs, and I think that what happens with universities is that people find the correlation between university attendance to university and your average income after going there, and they see, oh, it has to be because of the university. Yeah, well, but there's a huge filter before university of people coming there. So you're already selecting yourself because other people might not want to go there, or other people don't even try, or don't even are able to do it. So there's many filters at every level that end up making the substrate of the people in university already very different from the people who are not there. And if you account for those differences, the day they enter into the university, you eliminate.
Okay, so I'd like you to go back to that, though, because I think that's a good topic. You were starting to say that in Switzerland you have good apprenticeship programs, but there's still a lot of credentialing given to people who go to university. But you're saying it's not because of what the university did to them. It's more who goes to university. It's not the added value of the university. It's that they're a selection tool. But I would say, though, that there's a lot better selection. And people are learning that now with great inflation at universities. I think companies are beginning to realize that that isn't as good an index as it used to be.
Especially as a bigger percentage of the population goes to university, or where I originally come from, Spain. I think in my city, San Sebastian, there's 60% of the people going to university. Most of my friends have gone to university. And as you get a bigger and bigger sample of the society going to university, the demands in the university have to lower by definition, because you have people above average in intelligence going to university. So of course you're going to have to lower the standards, or you're going to have to shift people from STEM to other fields that are less cognitive demanding, because there's no other way. And then the correlation between income and all the good factors in life, that your intelligence and your good features that you were being pre-selected for in previous decades, stop being pre-selected for as much. Yes. And the correlation disappears. But you still have people wasting thousands and thousands of francs, euros, or dollars going to university, because even if you don't pay for it, the state is paying for it. So there's a huge capital misallocation in the higher education system that comes from a wrong theory of our nature, the denial of our nature, and I think that your work is very informative. If you realize that as time goes on, you don't only discover who you are, which is also important, but you become who you are. Just that would relax people and say, whatever your tendencies are will be shown with time. Do as good of a work you can, but if you start working at 18 and contribute to your family, and little by little pick up some books you are interested in, you will end up just as well as if you did go to university. That's, I think, my lesson and the life I'm trying to live by.
Well said. I think that's exactly right. I couldn't agree more. This is another example of assuming environmentalism. Kids who go to university, the university have added value and made them a better person, but it's not. It's the other way around. It's like they selected kids who do well at school. So the fact that they do well at university, okay. And as you say, as you start getting into over half the population going to university, that doesn't work so well anymore. So, but, having said that, though, I still am, a strong believer in people going to university if they want to, not because it's going to give them a better job. That's like the parenting. It's not the parents' role to make their kid a good citizen. That's not a factory model, right? And I think the same thing's true at university. But it's a great time for young people at that part of their life to find out what they want to do. I think that's the important thing, from a genetic point of view. Because how do you know? I'm suspicious in England, you have to decide at 16, 17, what you're going to do. And, you apply to university if you want to do maths or computers or whatever. You go and into that course. So I like the American model. I don't know how it is in Switzerland, but in America, you're not allowed to major. You're not allowed to specialize in the first 2 years. You have to take courses across the life sciences, humanities, all of that. You have to do that. And then you don't declare a major till your third year. I think that's a much better model because, some kids know what they want to do from early in life. In England, kids pretend that they know what they want to do because that's what they have to do in order to get into these better universities. They have to say, they're going to get into maths or my grandson into engineering at Cambridge. And you have to pretend that's what you wanted to do since you were a baby, But it can't be true, really, because how do you know? I mean, you haven't experienced these other things. So I think university is great for humanity reasons, and also finding out what you like to do. But it's not for everybody, and it shouldn't be a golden yardstick of, how good you are as a person. Because, I don't think we need more PhDs. We need more plumbers and nurses and, technicians, I think, people who can, well, anyway, so those are all my values, though, and they shouldn't get any more credence because I'm a scientist. Those are just personal values.
Let me try to one-up you, because I think no one has as yet played with you on this game. So you say that the denial of our nature is negative, but what if the denial of our nature is part of our nature? And your environmental intervention you're trying to make by illuminating our world through a very literally enlightened oriented perspective of understanding how the universe works, we will improve how we do. That's super enlightened, and you won't find a bigger fanatic of this idea than me. So I'm playing devil's advocate here, but I'm going to try to one-up you in this thing. Because maybe denying our nature is part of our nature, you, by trying to implement the right memes in our software, in our environment, you are trying to do an environmental intervention in our nature which was opposing the declaration of our nature. It's kind of like in a relationship, you have to take off the hands of the wheel and say, I'm here unconditionally. I'm not going to care about any variables that affect the cost-benefit analysis of me being in this relationship. This is unconditional. And that is part of our nature, and it was evolutionarily selected for. So what if what we're seeing is, and the emergence of the ideas, Freudianism, Marxism, all the bodies of thinking that deny our nature, what if that is part of our nature? Of course, you could argue that trying to find truth is also part of our nature. If not, we wouldn't even try.
Well, I'd agree with you. I think everything is heritable. And one of the more heritable aspects of social attitudes, say, is conservatism. Liberalism, conservatism. There's genetic influence on that. So if that's true, then anything you want to talk about, like you're saying, beliefs and determination, it probably is influenced by our personality to some extent, genetically. Doesn't mean you can't change it again. It doesn't mean you're hardwired to be that way. But it's part of finding out who you are. And I think more about what personality-wise, I used to study personality, and I think more of what you were talking about has to do with, I don't know, is it confidence, willingness to try things out. Some people are just anxious and, they want everything to stay the same, whereas other people, like me more, just say, give it a go. Let's see how it works, And you said with relationships as well, there's certainly genetic influence on that. Like people are surprised to find out divorce shows genetic influence. But we used that as an example before. In social science, divorce is used as a major environmental index of kids' maladjustment, right? The kids are screwed up because their parents got divorced, and they assume that that correlation is environmental. So just to test your audience, give them a little quiz here. Remember, I said the one thing to take away is when you find a correlation between an environmental measure like parenting or divorce and kids' outcome, just say, what about genetics? And you can see, is divorce environmental? Is it something that just happens to you? Definitely not. You have something to do with it. It's your relationship with somebody. So there's genetic influence on that. So, and it could be that, I think I mentioned in the book that I think it could be that the reason someone's interesting to you when you're in a romantic relationship, like they're just fun and they're thrill seekers, sensation seekers. Well, those things could actually be problematic for a long-term relationship because the person gets the 7-year itch in a couple years. They just want more experience, and one person can only give you so much. So, I don't know if I'd accept your view that you have to accept a relationship unconditionally. I don't think we ever do. Love is blind, maybe, but that's only early on. As you live your life day by day, things change. So, I think that's part of it as well. And I think that would be a blind sort of environmentalism thing, one true love. And once you fall in love, it's there forever. I mean, that would be like environmentalist, wouldn't it? And instead, you're two genetically different people, and at different points in your life. I got married very young at 19, my first marriage. And, what are the chances that two people would grow up the same over the decades? I mean, we're genetically different people. And is that so bad? I mean, we didn't have kids, so I think it's not so great for kids, probably. But, even so, there's the stuff about, so it's just saying divorce isn't just some environmental thing that's imposed on parents or on their kids. There's actually genetic influence on that. And we'd do well just to pay attention to that. And to understand yourself, I think, is to understand your genetics as best you can. And that's, I think, where the Buddhism doesn't really, or certainly Stoicism, they don't really recognize individual differences so much, whereas what we're about here is individual differences. And this reminds me to say something I should have said very early on. We have 3 billion base pairs of DNA, but 99% of them are all the same. We're all identical. And that's what makes us human. So most of our genetics is just the same. But we're talking about that 1% of those 3 billion base pairs of DNA that differs, because that's what can make us different. And that 1% makes us very different at the level of individual differences. But, if we were an alien coming from another planet or something, they'd look at all of us and say, yeah, they're all pretty much alike. Like, we think squirrels all look pretty much the same, don't they? But I mean, if you were a squirrel, you'd probably say, what are you talking about? That one's fat and ugly, and this one's a good athlete. They'd see those differences, but we don't see them. So we should put it in perspective, but I do think it's an important perspective, individual differences, because that's what we worry about as parents. Why are kids having trouble learning to read, for example, or, having particularly anxious and depressed? So individual differences are an important topic, but it's important to put it in perspective and to say we are all 99% identical genetically.
Yes, exactly. I'm sorry, maybe this is going for too long, but there's just one last comment, because I have ammunition. I have ammunition to fight 2 world wars here, but I want maybe this last one. You mentioned in Blueprint that there is no disorder. There's just a distribution and the tail ends of the distribution. And the black and white thinking of many bodies of thinking, like Freudianism, who would categorize people into having a pathology, or I think another body of thinking, maybe I'm completely off the hook here, is attachment theory in its detection of categories in a black or white thing instead of recognizing the existence of a spectrum. And I think that this way of thinking, this happened to me in high school. The teacher was complaining about so many of the students failing. And at some point I realized, well, if 60% of the students fail, it's not anymore about the students because they are a relatively representative sample of society. So it's now on you. If you're diagnosing as a pathology, as a psychological pathology, a high enough percentage of the population, you run out of mathematical power to diagnose anything because your definition is way too broad. Right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the point that you said you got excited about the idea of heritability increasing through the lifespan. And I said other people get interested in other things. Well, this is the topic that probably captures more people. And it's in a section called The Abnormal is Normal. And that's the idea that a lot of these categories, diagnostic categories, even schizophrenic or not, autistic or not, especially reading disabled or not, these educational things where they're not disorders. By a disorder, it comes from the medical model, which works very well. If you have an illness like cholera, why are people dying from cholera? This is in the 1800s. And you find out the cause, and it's like contaminated water. You find people going to this one well. They were getting ill. And now we know it's a bacteria in the water that causes it. So the medical model works extremely well if you have a simple cause, like COVID is caused by a virus. So you first diagnose it and you say, well, do they really have COVID or cholera? You got to diagnose it carefully and it is either or. You either have it or you don't. Necessary and sufficient. Whereas that works well for simple causes, but with complex traits and common disorders, it's never true. There are thousands of genes involved. So same thing with a single gene. If you had a single gene mutation like Huntington's disease, that's great. You want to say it's necessary and sufficient. So everybody with the mutation will have the disorder, and anybody who has the disorder has the mutation. Necessary and sufficient. So there the medical model is exactly right, works perfectly. The problem is that single gene mutations account for less than 1% of the medical burden. It's really bad for the people who have it, but they're very rare because thanks to natural selection. But the common disorders are not disorders. They're the low end of the normal distribution. So it's actually something I'm writing about right now. I wrote a paper in 2009 called Common Disorders Are Quantitative Traits. And that's what I mean by the abnormal is normal. It's just the low end of the normal distribution. It's not etiologically distinct. We're not going to find a gene or a brain abnormality for reading disabled children, and because it's just the low end of the same genetic and environmental factors that operate at the high end of the distribution. And we know that now from a molecular genetic research that it is the same genes. It's just quantitative and it's not qualitative. And that's true even for schizophrenia, for autism, as well as more common disorders. And especially my current bugaboo is the learning disorders, where it's a big thing. You push the medical model even harder because what parents want to know is their kid's having trouble learning to read at school. And so they get someone to say, now I understand. My kid has dyslexia. So not only do you say it's a problem with reading, you give it a Latin or Greek name to make it sound like a real medical disorder. But there is no disorder. These kids are just the lower end of a normal distribution, and it's the same genetic and environmental factor. So we're not going to find the gene for dyslexia. We've already done it. We find genes for reading ability. They will predict reading problems better than any sort of genetic research on a disorder of dyslexia. So the medical model is what's holding us back in psychology and psychiatry because we're not dealing with single gene mechanisms here. The single genes are important, but they're so rare, and you just don't see them like breast cancer. People think breast cancer is heritable. It's not. It's one of the least heritable things around. But because of Angelina Jolie, we know about this very rare, very severe early onset form, one gene that does cause breast cancer. There's 2 or 3 of them like that. And it's not to dismiss those, that's important. But it's to say the reason why identical twins, one last thing here, it's related to your general point though, and that is women listening to this, I understand there are not so many of them, but women listening to this, they have a 10% risk of having breast cancer. It's really a high risk. But what if they had an identical twin we haven't actually said this yet, but identical twins are clones, despite what people say. You can sequence their DNA and it's the same DNA because they are clones of one another. So if you are a woman who had a identical twin sister who has breast cancer, what's your risk? You'd think, well, if it's all genetic, your risk would be 100%. You're going to get breast cancer. Instead of 10%, it's 14%. It's like no greater risk. Breast cancer it's very largely not a matter of genetics. It's a matter of environment. And that's generally true of cancers. Cancers are not genetic in the heritable sense. They all involve DNA. They involve mutations of DNA, but somatic ones. They're not inherited, and you don't pass them on to your offspring. And the obvious thing is like I'm a walking test case for skin cancer because I love being in the sun. And what is skin cancer? It's like I get a mutation in one cell is all it takes, one cell where the regulatory mechanisms go crazy and you lose control. It's not something that infects you. It's you. It's your regulatory mechanisms that go wrong. And so it's not inherited. So the point there is that in the case of breast cancer it's not very heritable. And I don't know how we got onto that one, but we've been talking a long time, so I'm starting to babble a little bit.
No worries. If you're very talkative, this is very good. I wouldn't like to cut you off, but so if you happen to be okay with going to the 2-hour mark, that would be fine. If you happen to not want to, that's also fine. We can cut it off now. I'm flexible.
Okay. Well, have you got a few more things to talk about?
Of course, I'm not going to be the bottleneck here.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, let me get a quick coffee, okay?
I have a theory that might be a bit controversial, and it is that so many people say that homosexuality is natural to claim that it shouldn't be discriminated against. And many people say that homosexuality is not natural to claim that it should be disincentivized, let's say in a light manner. Those 2 groups of people use nature as a way to justify what should be done. But I think that's not the most enlightened way of thinking. The more scientific, enlightened way of thinking would be realizing what is true and basing your assessment on that, not on what you think happens to be natural. Of course, what is natural and what is true are the same thing, but what the predisposition of someone to be homosexual, it is natural, that's a fact. But it is also true, in my view, that the controlling of other people's sexuality is also part of our nature. The oppression, violence, even cancer are natural things of our environment. So if we're going to base our judgment on what is natural to determine what should be the case, we have to take into account another layer of what is natural, which is our judgment is also itself natural. So there's only nature against nature in this case. And sorry for the rambling, but I think that this conflict that we see between people emerges out of a wrong framing. If we focus in understanding how things work, and as we were talking about before, the Stoicism control diet of focusing the things that you can control and not in the things that you cannot control, both sides of this homosexuality being natural or not natural would take a step towards being enlightened.
Yes. No, I know what you're saying. And one thing to take a historical view on it, that underlines what you're saying is you say everyone assumes it's nature, but actually in the 60s and 70s, homosexuality was thought to be environmental, just as everything was thought to be environmental. And it was diagnosed as a pathology, and there was conversion therapy and that sort of thing going on because people thought it was just environmental. It was a lifestyle choice. And when I was in graduate school, I worked at an adolescent treatment center, and some of the boys there were gay. And, from early in life, they just knew they were gay. And maybe there are some people now, especially with all the concern about all the interest of young people in what do you call non-duality of the bi, what's it? They're
queers.
Yeah, no. I mean, where a lot of young people now claim they're bisexual, or what is it called? Where you could go either way. And to some extent, the Greeks promoted that. So maybe it's not natural to be as strongly heterosexual as we assume. But, evolutionarily, you got to say there's something to heterosexuality. But, so first point, it used to be all environmental, and now people recognize genetic influence. And again, like with schizophrenia, people said, well, that gives homosexuals an excuse to be homosexual. Well, it's not. It's as you're saying, let's find out what's true or not. Okay. And so I don't know if most people accept that homosexuality is genetic. I think certainly in America, there are still, the right wingers who, in funny way, you might expect a right winger to be more genetically oriented. But in some cases like this, they think it's, a lifestyle, and there's court cases about parents putting their kids through conversion therapy, thinking, they got to make them into a normal person. So, but your larger point is important that in general, our assumptions about what is true, should give way to science, because a lot of our assumptions are not right, like what's heritable or not. People think breast cancer is highly heritable. It's not. Mostly, if you do a survey, they don't think body weight obesity is very heritable, because you think, well, no, it's just willpower, and that's wrong too. So, the important thing is to assess, not to assume. And that's what science is good at. What you do with it, though, is the point you're making, and that's a matter of values, and I share your values on that. And in general, I believe in kind of individual freedom, and I want people to be free to be themselves, which in the case of homosexuality means to be homosexual. But that's just a value on my part. But in a way, it's a pretty basic value. It's just saying, people ought to have the freedom. It's sort of to be who they want to be, and that's also in the Constitution of America. The freedom of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as long as it doesn't affect other people.
Given that we're talking about distributions and that we vary in a normal way across most of the biological and sociological features that are not, let's say, winner-takes-all distributions, I think the same thing would be seen here. There's people who are extremely heterosexual and would very rarely or ever consider interacting sexually with someone of the same sex, but there has to be people who are somewhere in the middle and with the right context would think about it, and others who are clearly homosexual. So under very little or no context would consider interacting sexually with people of the other sex. And this distribution, I think, has to be modulated by features of the distribution itself. So this is the controversial theory I have, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it. I think that both the oppression of homosexuality and homosexuality are natural. And I'm not justifying anything by saying it's natural. I'm just saying they are a kind of heterosexual in reserve theory. So it's if you have a distribution of males who could be homosexual in case of a lot of competition for the few females around, then we can allow males to be a bit more homosexual, to give off the signs of homosexuality. And if we go to war and a lot of the males die off, then we can oppress the society. The society develops the oppression mechanism to force more heterosexuality to being shown. Would this auto-regulatory mechanism inside of society make any sense?
Well, this is a matter of my values, but I don't like totalitarianism. I don't like authoritarian governments telling people what to do. And especially, I mean, if I were, I happen to be heterosexual, pretty much far out on that dimension. And the thing is, this isn't a normal distribution, unlike a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. I mean, it's pretty bimodal. But as you say, there are people in the middle for sure. And within each of those modes of the bimodal distribution, there's a distribution, more or less for sure. I agree with all that. But I just am sort of repelled by the idea of the government telling someone, you ought to be this and this ought to be that. I think that ain't going to work.
No, I was talking of more subtle influences, the zeitgeist, how people conceive of homosexuality as being something marginally more or less acceptable, marginally more or less of a taboo, that doesn't have to come into law or being oppressed by anything. Because talking about margins, subtle effects create subtle differences. So that is the level of precision that we are handling with. And marginally, it would be beneficial maybe in a society with a worse ratio of males to females to have homosexuality as something slightly more of a taboo, so that we have a slightly bigger, like the price signals in a market, the price goes up, the cost stays the same, the margin of profit increases, it signals profitability, more people come into the market. So maybe this is a self-regulatory system, just as with prices in the market, in which if the price of a male goes down enough, we start taking back the dogma or the taboo about it a bit, and then the price of a male would go back to the same level.
I don't agree with that cost-benefit analysis, really. I think it's more profitable, instead of taboos, to think about positive incentives. So I'm interested in this topic in general because I think one of the biggest demographic problems we have is the inverted pyramid of the population, and younger people are not having kids. I mean, I just read this book, Alone in Japan, which is a demographer who spent time in Japan 30 years ago and has now gone back and seen this for real. People they're just not even pairing off. They're not having sex. They're not having kids, and they're not, and so they treat Japan as the canary in the coal mine because it was the first one to face this. They lived to later age. So I think that's a real problem, and we need to think of something to encourage people to have children. I don't think that's going to be getting homosexuals to become heterosexual. I think it's much more important to take the much larger population of heterosexuals and to figure out how we're going to get them to have kids. And it's not going to be like China, where they had a one-child policy, and then when they switched back to, they're now encouraging people. They're actually giving like lifelong benefits to people who have kids, and it's not working. So I don't think society has that much control over something as personal as having children. So I don't think the homosexuality example works very well because I think it's a real problem. We need to have more kids, but I don't think that's going to come from having homosexuals have kids. Although there are a lot of bisexuals. I mean, for a long time in England, a lot of the literary, intellectual people were gay, but they were having kids. They were in relationships because of the taboos that you were talking about. So they're okay about, living with a woman, even though they actually were gay. I mean, women are nice. I think my personal view is women are a lot nicer than men. So anyway, I think it's a red herring to talk about getting homosexuals to have kids. It's much more important and a hugely important topic. We've got to do something to get that replacement rate up over 2. It's going down to 1.3 in some countries. So we're below the replacement rates. And man, demographically, that's going to have more of an effect than everything. It's a hugely important problem. But I just don't think government policy is going to do much. Although in England, for sure, unlike Europe, England is very expensive to have a kid. I mean, childcare is not free, really, for most people. So good childcare is not free, and so there are some obvious things you can do to increase to make it easier for people to have kids. But partly it's valuing, don't you think? Valuing kids and valuing parents and being parents. And it doesn't have to be mothers being mothers, but, we need parents to be parents. And, I think more and more people, but as it gets more and more expensive, and in England, you got the additional problem. I don't know if it's true in Switzerland, but in England, there's a real problem with some state schools are not very good. And you're talking about hundreds of thousands of euros to have a kid go to a better primary school so that they can go to a better secondary school, so they can go to a better university. Although that runs up against what we were saying. That isn't the ultimate value in life. So lots of issues here, Alex. But
Yes. You are right at so many levels. The homosexuals, I think the best measures I've seen are around between 5 and 10% of the population. So in any effect, what I'm talking about, even if it's true, would be mostly irrelevant and a matter of a margin and indeed a red herring. And I don't know if even I'm right. It could be very well that I'm just saying nonsense and that this self-correcting mechanism in society doesn't even exist. So absolutely, your level at that first level of analysis, that the population is small, and we have to put a lot of focus in the bigger population of the less homosexual, or let's say heterosexuals, because as you said in the other comment, the distribution is binomial. Indeed, there's still some normal distribution within each of the peaks of the distribution, but that's also very true. And going back to your comment about in the UK, a lot of having childcare not being a lot of the childcare not being free, from an economics perspective, I think that has to do with positive externalities. So if you're assuming the cost of having a child, but the benefit is going to be externalized into society because you're going to shift back the distribution that you were talking about, the inverted pyramid in Japan, and especially in South Korea. I think South Korea is the worst.
Yes,
is in the worst situation. By having the kid, you are helping society have a healthier distribution of the population, which has a huge effect. I think the magnitude of the relevance of a distribution of the demographics are destiny. It is set in stone. You cannot create 20-year-olds now. You are 20 years late. Well, 20 years and 9 months late, but it's so. Maybe there's a case to be made that the state has to internalize this market failure. And I'm a libertarian myself, so if I have a bias, it's against this. But if I'm trying to make the case for it, because I'm not sure if this is true, I'm not sure if this is right, but maybe there's a positive externality big enough that cannot be internalized, that has to be done. But of course, in the 50s and even before the boomers, they were so many. Because I think societally, exactly as you were saying, the state has little influence in increasing fertility. If anything, with oppression, it can decrease it, as the one-child policy in China was quite effective. But now getting back the fertility, once the population, the society, the culture has changed towards appreciating other things more than having children, and where I come from, Spain, has the lowest fertility rate in the whole Europe, 1.1
really?
children.
Oh.
It's
despite
crazy.
Catholicism.
No, because of Catholicism. Because now the population has shifted. The religiosity transition that has occurred in Spain is almost not seen anywhere else. It has gone from being a very religious country 40 years ago to now, well, 40 maybe not, 60 years ago, to now being a very, very irreligious country. Very
really?
few. It's incredible.
I didn't know that.
It has been so fast, and so few of my friends are Catholic or religious at all, that it is remarkable. So I think Catholicism, I don't know if it would have kept the fertility rates up, but the transition away from Catholicism has been part of what has led to the decrease in the fertilities. But
right.
You were absolutely right when you said that it has more to do with the culture and the appreciation of having kids. That's, I think, the biggest driver of the fertility rate. Because in Spain, for example, the biggest focus is you have to enjoy life. You have to be able to go to the coffee shop every day and spend 10 euros there and have Netflix and travel to Bali twice a year and have a lot of vacation. And all of those things that you want to travel the world, discover yourself until your 30s or mid 30s, then you run way past your window of fertility as a woman. A man may be able to get away with it a bit more, but as a female, as a woman, which has a very narrow fertility window between the age of 18 and 35, that's your window. And if you don't take advantage of it, and the reason why it's not being taken advantage of or used is societal. You're absolutely right. But do you have any clue of how this transition socially could be done? Because I'm very hopeless.
Yeah. I wonder if some of what we've been talking about with genetics is important. You know, that at an evolutionary point of view, having children is something that we're designed to do. And a lot of people will tell you, I mean, I feel this way. I'd have as many kids as I could because it's, you know, I don't want to cause trouble or anxiety for people who aren't having kids. That's fine. Have that choice. But we don't have enough people saying it's the most wonderful thing in life. I mean, you think falling in love with someone is great. It'll change. But your love for your kids, you know, it's deep. And evolution designed it to be that way. So you're not fighting against something biological. You're going with your evolutionary flow. So we're, you know, and it's not all easy. It can be difficult, but it still is a very rewarding part of life. But being a Buddhist, I know everything's impermanent and things can change with your relationship with your kid. And you don't have kids because you want them to take care of you as an older adult, because that doesn't happen anymore. But for that time, and it's a long time, right? I mean, 20 years at least. And now I find I'm more involved with my grandchildren than I was with my kids, because I was busy working and all of that. But so I think, you know, we need to recognize that genetically there's really something pushing us to have kids, and we'll find it a very rewarding relationship because this person's 50% like you genetically. Your spouse isn't. At a DNA level, there is assortative mating, but you only correlate genetically with your spouse about 0.1. You can actually do this at a DNA level. You are picking someone who's sort of like you, especially in intelligence, it turns out. That's the most highest assortative mating. But it's only 0.1. You're 0.5 genetically related with your kid, and you learn to appreciate not just the similarities, but the differences. You know, so I think really a lot of the enjoyment of being a parent and recognizing genetics is that you marvel at watching this person become who they are genetically, in a way, you know, rather than thinking you're going to make them be what you want them to be. It's an amazing experience. Now, I would also say in balance that a lot of older people I know, if you get them in their cups, as we say, a little bit drunk or whatever, and say, you know, how was it having kids? And a lot of people would say, yeah, it's pretty good. I sort of remember how wonderful it was. But I think a lot of people in honesty would say, my life would have been okay if I didn't have kids. It's a bit like the military, you know, like the Marines or something. You'd say, well, it was I learned a lot. It was an experience. I wouldn't want to do it again. And I think definitely later in life, people, like you talk about older men, I wouldn't want to have kids now. Because, well, and it wouldn't be fair to them because I'd be dead by the time they're a young adult. So it is important to balance that, but that's the Buddhist thing. You know, you got to live in the moment and say, this is great while it happens. And I can guarantee that there will be moments of emotional enjoyment that are unparalleled with anything else in life, you know. So you think you love your spouse or whatever, and it's a different sort of love. But boy, this is intense, you know. So it's a wonderful thing having kids, and and then when you recognize the genetics behind that, this isn't just some current fad in society. I mean, this is us as a species, and then I think we need to do more to value having kids, you know, and realizing, you know. So what? You get another few papers published if you don't have a kid or whatever. who cares? I don't know of any academic. A lot of my friends are dying now. I spend a lot of my time going to festschrifts and funerals, it seems. And none of them would ever say, God, I just wish I had written that other paper. One more paper I really wanted to write. At the end of their life, or like in that lovely movie, Love Actually, where you have this scene, or scenes about, people coming back in airports, or the 9/11 stuff. Those text messages people sent. No one was saying, "Oh God, I was going to close this deal, and I got it." It's all about love, isn't it? And so I think it's important to keep that perspective on things. And if it's all about love in some ways, having kids is a love experience unlike anything else. So maybe there's a bit of a message we can help people with here. It's not really a genetic message so much, and we got to recognize that genetics says there'll be differences in how much parents are willing to be parents. Because it does mean you have to. It's not a selfish thing, and surprising. Even though parenting and loving your kids seems to be evolutionarily constrained in a way, there's still big individual differences. Just like with love relationships, some people aren't able to give up control, as you were talking about, and really fall in love, and that means you're going to get hurt. So some people aren't willing to do that, but I think parenting will take most people pretty far along in terms of that. When you first see your baby born, that really is an amazing experience. So let's encourage people to have kids, but I'm not saying it's a bad thing not to have kids. It's just we need to be more reinforcing of people who do have kids, because there's a lot of sacrifices. You have to sacrifice one of those trips to Bali, for example. But I got to say, at the end of life, later in life, like me, looking back on this stuff, I really get the Buddhism thing. I don't remember that trip to Bali. Really, I can look at the photographs or whatever. That's great. But, it's not that big a deal. Whereas my son's here and his grandson's here, and so that goes on, and it helps you think about continuity in life. It isn't genetics. The thing I don't like about Buddhism is the reincarnation notion, which is crazy. But actually, genetics is reincarnation, isn't it?
Yes.
My son and my grandson are definitely, those are my genes, and you could see it. We just look alike, even. And so what? I'm dead. I won't appreciate it, but there's still something about enjoying in the moment the fact that there is some continuity there. Despite the general impermanence of life, and the fact that extra trip to Bali isn't going to mean much to you a decade from now.
Exactly.
God, we're really getting into philosophy now.
No, but this is an extremely important point. I think that the demographic situation of Western countries, and this is a point that has not been talked about enough, not in our conversation, but in general. The countries of the second and third world have their fertilities drop faster than they did back in a few decades ago in Western Europe. And I've checked the research from Jesus Fernandez Villaverde. It's one of the most enlightened, I think, researchers in this matter, and he hypothesizes that these third and second world countries will stabilize beneath the fertility rates of the first world countries, which is mind blowing. I do not understand why it happens, but he has some serious and very solid research backing it, and I wonder why that is. But even from a existential perspective, you and I didn't come here out of nowhere. We didn't pop out into existence. It was two adults who were fairly functional, who decided to not go to Bali or to not do the marginal thing that they could have done in exchange for bringing someone up. It took a huge amount of effort and time to bring both of us up, and it is only because of that we exist now. And so it's a kind of, if you don't pay the amortization of your machines, you can run on a bigger profit, artificial profit for while the machine lasts, because we have so much income and little expenses. This is wonderful. Yeah, sure, until the machine breaks. And then you have to, the whole business collapses. And so Yep. Sorry.
Two general things there. There's one major factor is switching from an agrarian society to an industrial society. In an agrarian society, having kids are workers. So there's a huge motivation to have as many kids as possible. So that's one huge factor that we're not going to change. But the second factor is that despite what you said, my parents had kids. I'm a boomer, born right after the Second World War, and there was no birth control then, and there was no abortion. That wasn't in the States until the 70s, really. It wasn't really available till the 80s. So back then, a lot of people had kids just because they had sex and they couldn't control whether they had kids or not. So that's changed as well. And we're not going to go back on that. And so I think I don't know why it is as societies become richer, maybe it's just a financial model or something. It's not financially so great to have kids. I mean, they're not going to take care of you later in life. And so that's going to be a tough nut to crack. But yeah.
But why is it that they're not going to take care of you when you're old? I think that the negative externality I was arguing for to justify the intervention of the state subsidizing things so that they are free in the eyes of the consumer, even though there's someone paying for it, which is the average taxpayer. There's also another negative externality, but in this case created by the state. And I would argue it's even bigger than the presumed negative externality of the market that the state should solve. The kids don't take care of you because we've created alternatives to it. We've created, of course, the division of labor, and the market would have led to this no matter what, because we've specialized. Some people are good at taking care of others, and they do it professionally. And maybe you specialize in writing wonderful books, and I appreciate that because now I can read Blueprint, and my life is better for that. And I couldn't have benefited to the same degree if you had the marginal kid. So maybe there's a case to be made for the specialization, but It is a truth, I think, a fact that in the US, as the state took more of the percentage of the GDP across the centuries, the voluntary networks of help, which were mostly by family members, but also acquaintances and second-degree family members, decreased in prominence. And that's because you already were paying for that in an indirect way through taxes. So we stopped having a voluntary system, and we started having a coercive, forced, without opt-out clause out, because you have to pay Social Security, you have to pay taxes no matter what. So I don't want to ramble here into too much libertarianism. We said we weren't going to go into politics, but it could be the case that part of it has to do with that. Mm-hmm. But there's a second hypothesis that I have of why this is the case. As the life expectancy increases, it could be the case that society, we have a self-correcting mechanism, creating as many children as you expect them to be able to survive until they're 20. And because now we have basically zero childhood mortality in our Western countries, of course, that number had to decrease, the same way that it is now decreasing rapidly in Congo or in any Central African country, because they know that they feel that the more kids survive into their 10s, into their 20s, and that's why they logically have fewer children. But what happens if not only they get into their 20s, but into their 90s? Of course, childhood life expectancy is capped out. We're facing the biological limit of 120, and there's decreasing marginal returns to whatever environmental intervention of reducing entropy we apply. But maybe that's just a natural response. Decreased childhood mortality, increased life expectancy naturally would decrease our fertility rates. And that was a reasonable explanation for why it would self-adjust back in our evolutionary environment. But now we've taken life expectancy way far ahead of what was the case before. Maybe that has something to do. But as it stops increasing, maybe the fertility rate will go back to a stable 2.1 or 2.
Yeah. Well, it's a possibility. It's a 100-year difference, though, isn't it? I mean, at what point will young people today notice that people are living not average life expectancy of 70 years, but 72, then 76. And that does seem to be kind of incremental. And it strikes me that we think people are so rational, but I think to a greater extent than we think, people have kids because they have sex and they sort of get pregnant. I mean, I know a lot of people are very rational about it and they say, no, we can't have kids now. But I do know a lot of people who still, like in England, most people, the vast majority of couples don't get married till they have a kid. And so they're living with someone, and for one reason or another, they get pregnant, and then they decide to get married. And I do think there's a lot of, with politics as well, I'm increasingly thinking we think people are really thinking this stuff through deeply and finding out about stuff and then reaching this decision, I'm going to be hard right or I'm going to be hard left. I think people stumble into this stuff. Their friends are this way, and people aren't thinking as deeply about stuff as you might expect, especially with something like having a kid. I think there's a lot more caprice in it, and you're living with someone, get pregnant, yeah, okay, let's have a kid. And if we're going to have a kid, maybe we should get married so they have a more stable family life. So I don't know how we marshal that caprice in this direction. And I think it's more along the lines of what we were talking about earlier, about just making it cool to have kids and to realize that that is a wonderful thing you're doing, not just for yourself, but we need to recognize this is the most important thing in society right now. It's more important than climate change or anything, this inverted triangle business. And I've heard people say, well, they wouldn't want to have a kid because they wouldn't want to raise them in this horrible world that we're creating. That's bullshit, I mean, it is what it is, but we're not going to have a world if, especially as AI takes over jobs. People don't say, AI doesn't pay tax. Who's going to be paying this tax if our workers are AI, and we're going to lose those jobs. So I think there's going to be some dramatic transformations. And I do wonder if there aren't going to be jobs due to AI, and we're going to have to do something like UBI, Universal Basic Income, or just something like that. We're going to have to distribute the wealth somewhat differently, I think. And maybe that means we can have people don't have to move for their job. Maybe people can stay more in communities. Maybe families can stay together more. Maybe we would value, if you don't have to go into work every day and then you want to be ambitious and get more money than someone else, so you work harder than someone else, maybe you can just say, yeah, I got to do certain things, but I can stay at home and have kids. I mean, it might actually end up increasing our birth rate, because it's nice having kids. But right now, it's very expensive. We don't have the money for it. But what if money isn't a problem? I don't think it's ridiculous to think that AI is going to drastically change our work environment. Most people who study this sort of thing say the sorts of jobs people are going to have don't exist now. So you can't really train kids to be something. I mean, imagine any kid who wants to do computer science and programming now, they haven't read the news, So things are going to change a lot, and maybe we can marshal some of that to make it cooler and better and nicer to having kids, because it's not like you're duping people into having kids. You're not tricking them. It's a wonderful thing. But right now, the externalities are such, the expense and the responsibility, the sense that, oh my God, you're totally responsible for the way this kid turns out. I think that's part of it, isn't it? That you're really worried about, God, you're going to screw your kid up and you can't take that responsibility. So I think it's important for people to know it doesn't matter. You're not going to make a difference anyway. So that's one thing that would help people to have kids, is to realize this is just something you ought to enjoy. You don't have to worry about it because you don't make a difference anyway. So maybe that'll help. So I do think things are going to change. And it's great talking to you about this issue. This is way beyond my pay grade. And I do want to emphasize, I don't have any more value here than anybody else in terms of exposing my values about these things. Good point to call it here, do you think?
Yes, what a wonderful dovetail that you just made, tying everything down. And I do indeed agree with you that your research and the understanding that we get from your research of the influence of genes in how we develop into what we actually are, we become who we are with time. The correlation between identical twins increases with time, doesn't decrease. Keep that in the back of your mind, because that's a monument of a data point that we have to keep always in mind. That it would increase, indeed, I think, the predisposition of people to have kids. And it's one of the biggest problems we have right now, the inverted pyramid, as you mentioned. And I'm very thankful to you, Robert, for having this chat with me today.
Great chat with you. It was really wonderful talking to you, Alex.
Thank you very much.